The most dangerous people in America are never the ones screaming for power. They're the ones quietly holding it. Rain hammered the streets of downtown Washington, D.C. just after midnight, turning the sidewalks into rivers of blurred neon and shattered reflections. Red and blue police lights pulsed against the wet pavement like warning signals from a city that had forgotten how to breathe. A crowd had already formed outside the federal building on Constitution Avenue, drawn in by the sound of raised voices and the unmistakable tension that always followed flashing lights in a black neighborhood after dark. Officer Ryan Walker stood beside his patrol SUV, jaw tight, one hand resting near his belt while the other gripped the wrist of a black woman he had shoved against the side of the vehicle only moments earlier. "I said keep your hands where I can see them," he barked, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The woman didn't flinch. Rain rolled slowly down the side of her face, tracing along her calm expression as if the storm itself refused to disturb her composure. She looked to be in her early 40s, dressed in a charcoal gray coat over a navy business suit, her natural curls damp from the weather, but still perfectly composed. There was something unsettling about how calm she remained while strangers stood on the sidewalk filming her with their phones. Most people would have argued by now. Most people would have panicked. But not her. Her eyes stayed fixed on Ryan with a stillness that made even the younger officers nearby glance at each other nervously. "You're trespassing near a secured federal zone," Ryan snapped. "And unless you've got clearance higher than the president himself, you don't belong here." A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. An older black man standing beneath a bus stop shelter lowered his head the moment Ryan raised his voice again. Everyone knew that tone. Everyone knew the danger hidden inside that kind of authority. The woman slowly raised one hand, careful and controlled. "Officer," she said quietly, "you are making a very serious mistake." Ryan laughed under his breath. "Yeah? That what you people always say?" The air changed after those words. You could feel it. Even the rain seemed quieter for half a second. A teenage girl standing near the curb stopped recording and looked away, her face tightening with discomfort. But Ryan kept going, feeding off the attention now. "Let me guess," he continued, smirking as he yanked open the woman's leather bag. "Fake credentials, fake story, and suddenly everybody's a victim the second a cop asks questions." Papers scattered onto the wet pavement. A black folder slid beneath the SUV tire. The woman glanced down at it for only a second before lifting her eyes back to him. Still calm, still silent. Imagine standing there while strangers stare at you like you've already been found guilty. Imagine hearing people whisper while your dignity gets stripped apart under police lights in the middle of the street. And imagine knowing something nobody else around you knows. Something powerful enough to destroy careers before sunrise. Ryan leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound threatening. "I can make this night very difficult for you." The woman tilted her head slightly, rainwater dripping from her chin. Then, with a voice so controlled it almost sounded cold, she asked a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Officer Walker, are you absolutely sure you want to do this?" Somewhere in the distance, beyond the sound of thunder and traffic, the low roar of approaching helicopters began to shake the sky. The sound of helicopter blades rolled across the stormy sky, like distant thunder growing closer with every passing second, but Officer Ryan Walker barely looked up. His attention stayed fixed on Naomi Carter as rainwater dripped from the edge of his police cap onto the pavement below. Around them, the crowd had grown larger now, umbrellas opening beneath the flashing lights while cell phones remained raised, recording every second of the confrontation. Washington, D.C. had seen scenes like this before. A black woman stopped, a white officer escalating, strangers pretending not to stare while secretly waiting to see how bad things would become. Ryan took a step closer to Naomi, invading her space deliberately. "You think I am scared of some lawyer talk?" he asked. "Because I am not." Naomi said nothing. Her silence frustrated him more than shouting ever could. Most people tried to explain themselves when confronted by police. Most people got emotional. But this woman stood in the middle of the storm looking at him like she already knew how the night would end. Behind Ryan, Officer Daniel Reeves shifted uneasily beside the patrol SUV. Daniel was younger, barely 2 years into the department, and unlike Ryan, he had not learned how to ignore the feeling in his gut when something felt wrong. He glanced toward Naomi again. Her posture was too controlled, too confident. Even now, with rain soaking through her coat and strangers filming her online, she looked less like a suspect and more like someone observing a situation already beneath her. "Ryan," Daniel said quietly, "maybe we should verify her identification before this goes any further." Ryan scoffed without turning around. "I already know everything I need to know." He held up a black identification holder he had pulled from Naomi's bag moments earlier. Water dripped from the edges as he waved it carelessly. "These fake federal badges are getting more convincing every year." Several people in the crowd exchanged nervous looks. Naomi's eyes lowered briefly toward the badge in his hand before returning to his face. "You should not touch that," she said calmly. Ryan smirked. "Or what?" Somewhere above them, the helicopters sounded closer now, loud enough that people in the street began glancing upward through the rain. Two black vehicles turned onto Constitution Avenue in the distance, their headlights cutting through the storm like blades. Daniel noticed them first. His expression changed immediately. "Ryan," he muttered. "Federal convoy." But Ryan still refused to listen. Years of unchecked authority had hardened him into the kind of man who mistook arrogance for control. He stepped closer to Naomi again and lowered his voice. "You know what your problem is?" he asked. "People like you walk around acting important because nobody ever reminds you where you belong." The words hung in the cold air. A woman in the crowd covered her mouth. A man near the curb quietly muttered, "Jesus Christ." Daniel looked visibly uncomfortable now. Even the other responding officers had stopped moving. Nobody spoke. Nobody interrupted. The only sounds were rain hitting concrete and helicopter blades vibrating overhead. Then Naomi slowly lifted her eyes toward the sky. Calm, unshaken. "Officer Walker," she said softly, "there is still time for you to step away from this." Ryan laughed again, but the confidence behind it sounded thinner now. Because at that exact moment, the first black SUV came to a hard stop beside the sidewalk. Then another. Then another. Doors opened almost instantly. Men and women in dark tactical jackets stepped out into the rain with yellow letters stretched across their backs. FBI. The crowd fell silent so fast, it almost felt unnatural. Ryan's smile disappeared. Daniel took one slow step backward. And Naomi Carter finally straightened her coat, as if the real meeting of the night had only just begun. The street that had been filled with whispers only seconds earlier now stood frozen beneath the pounding rain as federal agents spread across the sidewalk with sharp precision. Their boots splashed through shallow puddles while the yellow letters across their jackets caught the glow of police lights and passing traffic. Nobody in the crowd spoke anymore. Even the phones recording the scene seemed to lower slightly, as confusion turned into disbelief. Officer Ryan Walker stared at the line of agents stepping out of the black SUVs, and for the first time that night, uncertainty crept into his expression. Beside him, Officer Daniel Reeves swallowed hard. "Ryan," he whispered, barely audible over the helicopters overhead, "I think we need to stop this right now." But Ryan's pride had carried him too far already. Men like him spent years believing authority could never be questioned, believing the badge on their chest protected them from consequences ordinary people had to fear. And standing in front of dozens of witnesses, he refused to look weak now. A tall federal agent moved through the rain toward Naomi with purpose in every step. He was older, silver-haired, wearing a dark overcoat beneath his FBI vest. The moment he reached the sidewalk, his eyes locked onto Ryan. "Remove the restraints from Director Carter immediately," he said. The words landed like thunder. "Director Carter." The crowd reacted instantly. Gasps rippled through the street. Someone dropped their phone onto the wet pavement. Daniel's face lost all color as he slowly turned toward Naomi, finally understanding why her calm had never broken. But Ryan remained frozen, trying to process what he had just heard. "Director?" he repeated quietly, almost to himself. Naomi reached up slowly and adjusted the sleeve of her coat with complete composure. Rain rolled down her face, but her voice remained steady. "I gave you multiple opportunities to walk away from this peacefully, Officer Walker." The helicopters hovered lower now, their lights sweeping across nearby buildings and flashing through the rain like giant moving shadows. Additional federal vehicles blocked both ends of the street, sealing the area completely. The power dynamic had shifted so fast it left the entire block breathless. Ryan finally let go of Naomi's wrist. His hand trembled slightly as he stepped backward, Nobody told me who she was, he said defensively, looking around as though someone else might rescue him from the moment closing in around him. The older FBI agent stared at him without sympathy. That is because your job was to follow procedure, he replied coldly. Not make assumptions based on race. Silence swallowed the street again. Those words hit harder than shouting ever could. Somewhere in the crowd, an older black woman slowly shook her head with tears in her eyes. She had likely lived through moments like this her entire life. Watching authority humiliate people who looked like her. Watching dignity questioned under flashing lights. Watching silence protect the wrong people over and over again. Naomi bent down calmly and picked up the black folder Ryan had thrown into the street earlier. Water dripped from its edges as she held it carefully against her chest. Then she looked directly at Ryan. Do you know what is inside this folder? She asked softly. Ryan said nothing. Naomi's eyes never left his. 11 months of evidence, she continued. Internal reports. Civil rights complaints. Illegal traffic stop patterns. Recorded conversations. Names. Daniel slowly lowered his head. The realization was settling over everyone now like the storm itself. This night had never been random. Ryan had not stopped an ordinary woman outside a federal building. He had stopped the person leading one of the largest investigations into police misconduct the city had ever seen. And standing beneath the spinning helicopter lights, surrounded by agents, cameras, and witnesses, Officer Ryan Walker suddenly understood the terrifying truth. The woman he tried to humiliate had been watching him the entire time. Rain continued pouring across Constitution Avenue, while the city around them seemed to hold its breath. Federal agents moved with controlled urgency through the blocked intersection, speaking quietly into radios as more black vehicles lined the curb beneath the spinning lights overhead. The crowd had doubled now. People stood shoulder to shoulder under umbrellas and storefront awnings, whispering to one another while phones captured every second of what was unfolding. But the loudest sound on the street was no longer the helicopters or the sirens. It was silence. The kind of silence that comes when people realize power has suddenly changed hands. Officer Ryan Walker stood motionless beside his patrol SUV, water dripping from the edge of his sleeves as he stared at Naomi Carter with disbelief written across his face. Minutes earlier, he had treated her like someone who did not belong near a federal building. Now the same street felt like it belonged entirely to her. Naomi opened the black folder slowly, careful not to damage the documents inside. Even soaked by rain, the pages remained organized with colored tabs and handwritten notes visible beneath the flashing lights. She glanced down briefly before looking back at Ryan. For almost a year, she said calmly, my team monitored complaints tied to your precinct. Ryan swallowed hard, but tried to regain control of his voice. You investigated me? Naomi's expression never changed. No, she replied quietly. We investigated a pattern. Those words landed heavier than accusations. Because deep down, Ryan understood exactly what she meant. This was never only about one traffic stop or one complaint. It was about years of behavior nobody had challenged. Years of assumptions hidden behind procedure. Years of citizens leaving encounters humiliated while officers walked away untouched. Officer Daniel Reeves stood nearby listening in complete silence. His shoulders looked smaller now, as though the weight of the night had finally settled onto him. He replayed every moment in his mind. Ryan mocking her. The crowd watching helplessly. The federal badge tossed carelessly into the ring. Daniel realized how close he had come to becoming part of something irreversible. Naomi flipped to another page inside the folder. 38 civilian complaints connected to unlawful searches, she continued. 12 involving racial profiling. 4 involving intimidation during routine stops. Ryan shook his head immediately. Those complaints never went anywhere. Naomi looked directly into his eyes. That was the problem. Somewhere behind the crowd, thunder rolled across the city. The rain softened slightly now, turning into a cold, steady drizzle that reflected the blue and red lights across the pavement. One of the federal agents approached Naomi carefully and handed her a tablet device. She studied the screen for a moment before nodding once. The warrants have been signed, the agent informed her quietly. Ryan's face tightened instantly. Warrants. Several officers standing near the patrol cars exchanged uneasy glances. The atmosphere shifted again. This was becoming larger than anyone imagined. Naomi handed the tablet back calmly. Corruption investigations rarely begin with dramatic moments, she said. They begin with small abuses people convince themselves are normal. Her words cut through the street with terrifying precision. Imagine standing there realizing the habits you defended for years had quietly become evidence. Imagine hearing your own actions described not as mistakes, but as part of a system designed to humiliate people who never had the power to fight back. Ryan looked around desperately now. Cameras, witnesses, federal agents. Every escape route felt closed. And for the first time that night, he noticed something that unsettled him more than anything else. Naomi was not angry. She was disappointed. That calm disappointment in her eyes carried more weight than yelling ever could. She stepped slightly closer, her voice low and controlled. "You believe the badge gave you permission to decide who mattered," she said. "That is why you never realized someone was watching." Then, across the street, another line of unmarked federal vehicles appeared through the rain, and the expressions on several officers' faces changed from nervousness to fear. The rain finally began to ease over Washington, D.C., but the cold tension hanging over Constitution Avenue only grew heavier. Flashing emergency lights reflected across the wet pavement, while federal agents continued moving through the blocked intersection with quiet efficiency. One by one, marked police vehicles were being repositioned away from the federal convoy, as though invisible lines had suddenly been drawn between who still held authority and who no longer did. The crowd remained packed along the sidewalks despite the weather. Nobody wanted to leave now. People sensed they were witnessing the kind of moment usually buried behind closed doors and hidden reports. Officer Ryan Walker stood near the hood of his patrol SUV with his hands trembling slightly at his sides. Every confident word he had spoken earlier now echoed back inside his head with unbearable weight. He replayed the moment he mocked Naomi Carter, the moment he ignored her warning, the moment he decided her skin color told him everything he needed to know. Across from him, Naomi remained perfectly composed beneath the glow of helicopter lights sweeping across the street. There was no anger in her face, no satisfaction, just the calm focus of someone who had spent years preparing for this exact night. She turned slightly toward the line of federal agents standing nearby. "Begin Phase 3, she instructed quietly. The agents nodded immediately. Within seconds, phones and radios across the street erupted with activity. Several local officers looked around in confusion as more unmarked federal vehicles arrived at nearby corners. One patrol lieutenant stepped forward nervously. "Director Carter," he asked carefully, "how extensive is this operation?" Naomi paused before answering. "Large enough that some people in this city will wake up tomorrow and realize the system they trusted was never protecting everyone equally." Those words settled over the street like fog. Somewhere in the crowd, a young black father pulled his son a little closer beneath his jacket. An elderly woman wiped tears from her cheeks while staring silently at the federal agents surrounding the block. For many watching, this was bigger than one officer, bigger than one stop outside a federal building. It felt like years of frustration finally being spoken out loud. Officer Daniel Reeves slowly approached Naomi, his voice hesitant. "Director Carter," he said quietly, "did you know tonight what happened?" Naomi looked at him for a long moment before answering. "I knew Officer Walker had a history of escalation during encounters involving black civilians," she replied calmly. "But I still hoped he would choose differently when given the chance." Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. The disappointment in her voice cut deeper than anger ever could. Ryan finally stepped forward again, his expression tight with desperation now. "You set me up," he said. Naomi's gaze moved toward him slowly. "No, Officer Walker," she answered. "I gave you freedom. You revealed yourself." Silence swallowed the street once more. Imagine hearing that truth while every camera around you continues recording. Imagine realizing nobody forced your words, your actions, or your assumptions. They simply watched long enough for the mask to fall on its own. A federal agent approached Naomi carrying another folder, thicker than the first one. "Additional warrants approved," he informed her. Ryan's breathing visibly changed. "Additional." The older silver-haired FBI agent stepped closer this time. "Financial misconduct. Civil rights violations. Evidence suppression." He paused briefly before adding, "In coordination with officers currently under internal investigation." Several local officers immediately looked away from Ryan after hearing those words. The isolation hit him all at once. The same badge that once made him feel untouchable now seemed to separate him from everyone around him. Naomi closed the folder carefully against her chest. "This investigation was never built around revenge," she said quietly. "It was built around truth." Then another voice suddenly came through one of the federal radios with sharp urgency. "Director Carter," the agent said, touching his earpiece. "Media helicopters just arrived over the district." Naomi lifted her eyes toward the storm-dark sky while the sound of additional aircraft echoed overhead. And standing beneath those lights, Ryan Walker realized the entire country might soon witness the consequences of a single night he thought nobody important was watching. The storm clouds hanging over Washington, D.C. drifted slowly across the night sky, while media helicopters circled above the federal district like vultures drawn toward a story too large to ignore. Bright spotlights swept over Constitution Avenue, illuminating soaked sidewalks, police cruisers, and the growing wall of cameras gathering behind temporary barricades. News crews had begun arriving from every direction now, their vans crowding nearby intersections as reporters whispered urgently into microphones. The city could feel it. Something historic was unfolding in real time. At the center of it all stood Naomi Carter, calm and composed beneath the flashing lights, while federal agents moved around her with disciplined precision. Her dark coat clung slightly from the rain, but her posture never weakened. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent an entire career walking into rooms where people underestimated her before realizing too late who she truly was. Across from her, Officer Ryan Walker looked like a man slowly watching his world collapse inch by inch. Every passing minute made the situation worse. More agents, more witnesses, more cameras. He glanced toward the crowd and noticed something unfamiliar in their eyes now. It was no longer fear. It was accountability. The silver-haired FBI agent stepped beside Naomi again. "Director Carter," he said quietly, "the Attorney General approved full execution authority 15 minutes ago." Naomi nodded once. "Begin notifying precinct commanders." Ryan immediately looked up. Execution authority for what? Nobody answered him at first. That silence frightened him more than yelling ever could. Imagine standing there surrounded by people who suddenly know more about your future than you do. Imagine realizing every choice you made thinking nobody important was watching had quietly become part of a much larger picture. Naomi finally turned toward him again. "Tonight was not only about you, Officer Walker," she said softly. "It was about a culture." Nearby, several federal agents began opening sealed evidence containers inside one of the SUVs. Thick stacks of files emerged one after another, each marked with official seals and case numbers. Officers standing nearby exchanged uneasy glances as names were quietly spoken between agents. Some stepped farther away from Ryan instinctively, as though proximity itself had suddenly become dangerous. Officer Daniel Reeves remained frozen near the patrol vehicle, struggling to process everything unfolding around him. He had joined law enforcement believing the badge represented protection and service. But tonight he was witnessing another reality entirely. A system where silence had allowed abuse to survive for years unchecked. Naomi noticed him watching. "Officer Reeves," she said calmly. Daniel straightened immediately. "Yes, ma'am. You asked earlier whether I knew this would happen tonight." He nodded slowly. Naomi's voice remained steady. "No investigation succeeds because one person is corrupt. It succeeds because too many good people convince themselves it is safer not to speak." Daniel lowered his eyes again, shame creeping across his face. Those words cut deeper than any accusation. In the distance, thunder rumbled again while television cameras zoomed closer behind the barricades. One reporter spoke rapidly into a microphone while pointing toward the federal convoy. The story was spreading now far beyond Constitution Avenue. Millions of people would likely wake up tomorrow hearing about this night. Ryan noticed the cameras turning toward him, and panic finally cracked through his expression completely. "This is insane," he muttered. "You are turning me into some kind of symbol." Naomi stared at him quietly for several seconds before answering. "No," she said softly. "You became that symbol long before tonight." The wind shifted sharply across the street, carrying the sound of helicopter blades lower overhead. A federal agent approached Naomi quickly with another update. "Director Carter," he said, The first coordinated arrests are underway across 3 precincts. Several officers nearby visibly stiffened after hearing those words. The operation was spreading, bigger than anyone imagined. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, as if absorbing the weight of years finally reaching their breaking point. Then she opened them again and looked toward the city skyline, glowing faintly through the rain. "For too long," she said quietly. People confused silence with peace. And standing beneath the lights of media helicopters and federal vehicles, the entire street seemed to realize that silence had finally come to an end. By midnight, Constitution Avenue no longer looked like an ordinary street in the nation's capital. It looked like the center of a reckoning. Media vans stretched for blocks beneath the glow of streetlights and helicopter beams, while reporters stood shoulder to shoulder behind federal barricades, broadcasting live updates into cameras as rainwater dripped from their jackets. Every television station in the city seemed to be focused on one question. How had a routine police stop exploded into a federal corruption investigation in a matter of hours? But the people standing closest to the scene understood something the cameras could not fully capture. This moment did not begin tonight. Tonight was simply the moment everything hidden finally became impossible to ignore. Naomi Carter stood beneath the rotating lights of the federal convoy with complete composure while agents continued moving around her. The storm had weakened into a cold mist now, but the air still carried the heavy tension of something irreversible unfolding. Across the street, several local officers had already surrendered their badges pending federal review. Others stood frozen beside their patrol vehicles, staring at the ground as though afraid eye contact alone might expose them next. Officer Ryan Walker remained near the curb, surrounded not by support, but by distance. Nobody stood beside him anymore. Not the officers who once laughed at his jokes. Not the supervisors who ignored complaints. Not even the crowd that earlier feared him. Isolation wrapped around him tighter with every passing second. He watched as another federal agent approached Naomi carrying a sealed evidence case. "Director Carter," the agent said quietly. The encrypted server records matched the body camera gaps exactly. Naomi nodded once. "How many incidents?" 43 confirmed so far. Ryan's face immediately tightened. "Body camera gaps," he repeated. The silver-haired FBI agent finally turned toward him fully. "Video files missing during civilian encounters involving racial complaints," he explained coldly. Funny how often technology failed only when certain citizens were involved. The crowd reacted instantly. Angry whispers spread across the barricades while reporters leaned closer, trying to hear every word. Somewhere nearby, a woman muttered softly, "We knew it." Imagine living your whole life being told your experiences were exaggerations. Imagine filing complaints nobody answered. Imagine hearing officials promise fairness while evidence quietly disappeared behind locked doors. And then imagine standing there when the truth finally surfaces in front of the entire country. Ryan shook his head quickly, panic breaking through again. "I did not control body cameras." Naomi looked at him steadily. "No," she said softly. "But you benefited from the silence surrounding them." Those words hit harder than accusations because they carried truth without emotion. Naomi never raised her voice. She never needed to. Her calm exposed people more effectively than anger ever could. Officer Daniel Reeves remained standing nearby, visibly shaken as he listened. The younger officer looked toward Naomi carefully. "Director Carter," he asked quietly, "how long were you undercover?" Naomi's eyes moved toward the federal building towering behind them. "Long enough to watch good officers stay quiet while bad ones became comfortable," she answered. Daniel lowered his head again. The shame in his expression was impossible to hide now. Not because he had committed crimes himself, but because he finally understood how silence protects systems long after conscience begins warning people something is wrong. A loud burst of voices suddenly erupted from the media line as new information reached reporters through police scanners. Several cameras immediately turned toward Ryan again. One reporter spoke loudly into her microphone. "Sources now confirm multiple coordinated federal actions tied to misconduct investigations within the Metropolitan Police Department." Ryan's breathing became uneven. His eyes darted across the crowd, searching for control that no longer existed anywhere around him. Naomi stepped forward slightly, rain glistening along the edge of her coat beneath the helicopter lights. "Officer Walker," she said calmly, You spent years deciding who looked suspicious before learning who they really were. Ryan stared at her silently. Naomi's voice remained low and steady. Tonight, the country is finally doing the same thing to you. And somewhere beyond the barricades, the crowd that once stood silent beneath police lights slowly began to applaud. The applause spreading through the crowd did not sound joyful. It sounded exhausted. The kind of applause that comes from people who have waited years to see someone powerful finally held accountable beneath the same lights that once made ordinary citizens feel small. Constitution Avenue had transformed completely now. News helicopters hovered low over the federal district while camera crews pushed closer against the barricades, trying to capture every angle of the unfolding investigation. Rain still clung to the streets, turning the city into a blur of reflections and flashing emergency lights. But nobody seemed to notice the weather anymore. All attention remained fixed on the line dividing two worlds. On one side stood federal agents, organized and controlled. On the other stood officers realizing the system protecting them had begun collapsing in public view. Naomi Carter remained at the center of the storm with the same quiet composure she had carried since the moment Officer Ryan Walker first stopped her outside the federal building. She never raised her voice, never demanded attention. Yet somehow every person on that street seemed to move around her gravity. Ryan stood near the curb, shoulders tense, his expression drained of the confidence that once fueled every word he spoke earlier that night. The badge on his chest no longer looked like power. It looked heavy. One of the federal agents approached carrying a small evidence envelope. Recovered from internal storage, he informed Naomi quietly. Archived complaint footage. Naomi opened the envelope carefully and removed several printed photographs. Her eyes moved slowly across them before she handed one to the silver-haired FBI agent beside her. His jaw tightened immediately. "How old is this?" he asked. 3 years, Naomi answered softly. Ryan stared toward the photographs from several feet away, and the color slowly drained from his face again. He recognized them instantly. Old traffic stops, civilian complaints, encounters he had long ago convinced himself no longer mattered because nobody forced him to answer for them. But evidence has a strange way of surviving, even when people try to bury it. Imagine living so long, without consequences that you begin believing your actions disappear once the moment passes. Imagine forgetting that every person humiliated under flashing lights carries the memory long after officers drive away. Naomi slowly stepped toward Ryan again, while the cameras continued rolling from every direction. "Do you know what surprised me most during this investigation?" she asked calmly. Ryan said nothing. Naomi held the photographs carefully in her hands. "It was not the cruelty," she continued. "It was how ordinary everyone acted while it happened." The crowd fell silent again. Those words struck deeper than any accusation because nearly everyone standing there understood them. Silence had become routine. Looking away had become routine. Explaining away injustice had become routine. Officer Daniel Reeves stood nearby listening with his head lowered. "Director Carter," he asked quietly, "what happens now?" Naomi looked toward the federal building towering over the street. "Now," she said softly, "people answer for what they normalized." The silver-haired FBI agent stepped forward, holding an official document folder sealed with federal markings. Reporters immediately pushed closer against the barricades. Ryan noticed the folder and instinctively took half a step backward. "Officer Ryan Walker," the agent announced firmly, "you are hereby placed on immediate administrative suspension pending federal review connected to civil rights violations and obstruction-related investigations." The words echoed across the wet street beneath the roar of helicopters overhead. Several cameras zoomed directly onto Ryan's face, while nearby officers looked away completely. Nobody defended him now. Nobody interrupted. The isolation surrounding him had become absolute. Naomi watched him quietly for several seconds before speaking one final time. "You thought authority meant having the power to humiliate people without consequences," she said calmly. "But real authority begins with protecting people you have the power to hurt." Ryan lowered his eyes for the first time all night. Somewhere beyond the barricades, a young black girl standing beside her mother stared at Naomi with wide eyes filled not with fear, but something far more unfamiliar in moments like these: hope. And beneath the cold lights of Washington, D.C., that single feeling seemed more powerful than every badge on the street combined. By 1:30 in the morning, the rain had finally stopped over Washington, D.C., leaving the streets slick beneath the glow of streetlights and federal flood lamps. Constitution Avenue looked transformed now, almost unreal, as if the city itself had paused to witness the collapse of something people once believed could never be questioned. Helicopters still circled high above the federal district, while reporters continued broadcasting live updates from behind barricades crowded with exhausted citizens who refused to leave. But the energy on the street had changed. Earlier that night, fear had filled the air. Now it was something else. Reflection. Naomi Carter stood near the entrance of the federal building watching agents move evidence cases into secure vehicles one by one. Her expression remained calm, but the weight behind her eyes told a deeper story. Nights like this did not happen because one person suddenly decided to fight injustice. They happened because countless people spent years carrying pain nobody wanted to hear about until silence finally became impossible to maintain. Officer Ryan Walker sat alone on the curb several yards away, no longer surrounded by authority, only by cameras and consequences. His patrol vehicle had already been removed from active service. His radio sat disconnected on the hood beside him. The same city streets that once made him feel powerful now felt cold and unfamiliar. Imagine spending years believing control and respect were the same thing. Imagine discovering too late that fear can force silence, but it can never create trust. Nearby, Officer Daniel Reeves watched federal agents carrying boxes of evidence into black SUVs. He looked emotionally exhausted, as though one night had aged him years. Slowly, he approached Naomi again. "Director Carter," he said quietly, "how do you keep doing this?" Naomi turned toward him gently. "Doing what?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "Walking into places where people already decided who you are before you speak." Naomi looked toward the crowd gathered behind the barricades. Families, reporters, elderly citizens standing in the cold, young children sitting on their parents' shoulders trying to understand what they were witnessing. "Because if people stop walking into those places," she said softly, "nothing ever changes." Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing every word. In the distance, church bells rang faintly somewhere beyond the federal district, echoing through the quiet streets like the end of something old. Or maybe the beginning of something new. The silver-haired FBI agent approached Naomi, holding a final report folder beneath his arm. "The Attorney General wants a briefing at 7 o'clock this morning," he informed her. Naomi accepted the folder calmly. "And the officers?" she asked. "Processing has already started across all 3 precincts." Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Not in relief, not in victory, just exhaustion. Because justice was never as simple as punishment. Justice meant confronting systems people benefited from for years while pretending not to see the damage left behind. Ryan slowly lifted his eyes toward Naomi one final time. His voice sounded smaller now. "Fragile. Was there ever a moment you were afraid tonight?" Naomi studied him quietly before answering. "Yes," she said softly. "Not for myself." Ryan frowned slightly. Naomi's eyes drifted toward the young black girl, still standing near the barricades with her mother. "I was afraid another child would grow up believing humiliation is normal when someone in power decides they do not belong." Silence settled across the street once more. No helicopters, no shouting, just the quiet